In this next section, we will revisit X-rays and look at some more properties of X-rays that we are now able to discuss since we have a knowledge of how energy levels exist in an atom as explained by the Bohr model. So this is a graph we have seen before. It's the spectrum of X-rays. And X-rays, just to remind you, are mainly produced when fast-moving electrons are brought to an abrupt rest when they hit a metal target. And because of the large amount of deceleration involved, there's electromagnetic radiation which is emitted, and that electromagnetic radiation is in the X-ray region of the electromagnetic spectrum. And in this graph, you see the intensity of X-ray on the y-axis as a function of frequency. So you have this range of frequencies exhibited by the X-rays that are produced. On the rightmost end of this graph is the maximum frequency that the X-ray can have, and that corresponds to the electrons with maximum kinetic energy being stopped. Because all of that, the kinetic energy that the electrons have is basically converted to electromagnetic energy, and electrons that had the maximum kinetic energy, when their energy is converted to electromagnetic energy, then photons with maximum energy are produced. And since energy is h times f, that corresponds to the maximum frequency. Now, as you can see, and as you saw earlier too, most of this spectrum of X-rays is a smooth curve, which basically comes about because of what I just described, electrons being brought to abrupt rest, and as a result, electromagnetic radiation being emitted. So the maximum kinetic energy of the electrons that exists corresponds to hf max, and in an X-ray tube, electrons are accelerated by allowing them to move across a potential difference. And this V is the potential difference which accelerates the electrons. So hf max is the charge of the electron times the potential difference across the X-ray tube, because QV, charge times the potential difference, is the energy that a charge acquires as it accelerates across that potential difference. So that's basically the smooth part of the curve. And then in addition, you also see these spikes. What happens is sometimes part of the energy of the electrons that are being decelerated is transferred to orbital electrons in the target metal. And this will happen only when the energy of the electron matches exactly with the difference between the energy levels inside the target atom. So if there is this match, then the atom will absorb the energy of the electron and make a transition to one of the excited states. And then it stays there for a short period of time and then falls back to the ground state, in the process emitting photons. So that's what these spikes represent. Now, the location of these spikes is a characteristic of the element of the target metal. And so by looking at the location of these spikes, one is able to identify the element in the target. So for that reason, these are called the spikes are called the characteristic X-rays because their frequency is characteristic of the target metal and its energy levels. Now, these are the transitions involved in producing the characteristic X-rays. So a characteristic X-ray is emitted when an electron fills an inner shell vacancy. So these are like orbits closer to the nucleus. So if the metal target, the atom of the metal target, makes a transition from the ground state n equals 1 to one of these excited states, 2, 3, 4, etc., then depending on the fall, so the atom stays in those excited states for a bit and then eventually falls back to a lower energy state. So if the excited atom falls back to the ground state, n equals 1 state, then those spikes, those X-rays which are emitted, constitute the K series. So you see K alpha here and K beta there. K alpha is the X-ray produced when the atom makes a transition from n equals 2 to n equals 1 state. K beta corresponds to transition from or descending from n equals 3 to n equals 1. Similarly, there are L series spikes as well. These occur when the final state is n equals 2 state. So L alpha is when the transition is from 3 to 2, L beta is from 4 to 2, etc. So for the K series, NF, the final N is 1. Within the K series, alpha corresponds to Ni being 2 and beta corresponds to Ni being 3. In the L series, the final state is n equals 2, and then alpha means Ni is 3, and beta means Ni is 4. Now, the target elements, the atoms, are obviously multi-electron atoms. So there are some additional effects which are observed in these that don't happen in hydrogen. So these are multi-electron atoms. So what happens is the electrons which are in the outer orbits are sort of screened from the nucleus. So the Coulomb force or the potential, the electrostatic potential of these outer electrons is somewhat different from what it would be if there was no charge, if there are no further electrons between them and the nucleus. So this is called screening. In a sense, then these outer electrons are shielded from the nucleus to some extent. And that has an effect which needs to be taken into account, and the equations get slightly modified. For the K series, instead of Z, the number of protons, these electrons see only Z minus 1 protons, as if they see one less proton than there actually is. So in the equations for energy and so forth, Z has to be replaced by Z minus 1. For the L part of the spectrum, L spikes, Z prime is Z minus 7.4. So you have to subtract 7.4 from the number of protons to get the correct equation. So when you're doing problems involving these spikes, these characteristic X-rays, then you have to keep in mind to modify the equations accordingly. depending on whether it's K or L. Characteristic X-rays is a powerful technique used to identify elements. So if there are trace amounts of certain elements in environmental or biological samples, just tiny bits, they can be detected using the location of these characteristic X-rays. Okay, let's look at problem number 26. A color television tube also generates some X-rays when its electron beam strikes the screen. What is the shortest wavelength of these X-rays? So shortest wavelength, remember, is largest frequency. What is the shortest wavelength of these X-rays if a 30 kilovolt potential is used to accelerate the electrons? So shortest lambda means largest frequency. V here is 30 kilovolts, so 30 times 10 to 3 volts. And then using the equation HF max is QEV, we convert this left side. We go from frequency to wavelength. So we replace F by C over lambda. And then we solve this equation for lambda. If HC over lambda is QV, then lambda is HC over QV. Plug in the numbers and you get a wavelength of 4.13 times 10 to the negative 11 meters, or about 413 nanometers. X-rays have a lot of applications in medical diagnosis and airport security and so forth. What's known as CT scan is basically a three-dimensional X-ray image. It creates three-dimensional X-ray images, which give you a better sense of what's going on inside the body. Now, the wavelengths of X-ray, remember X-ray has a high energy, so it's a high frequency uh, compared to visible light, compared to ultraviolet, etc. So which means they have small wavelengths. And the, the scale of the wavelength is related to how good the images can be formed using these electromagnetic radiations. So the wavelength of X-rays is smaller than the atomic size. So they can be used to explore the atomic and molecular structure of matter. There's one commonly employed technique, which is called X-ray crystallography, in which atoms and molecules act as slits. Like we talked about for a double slit experiment, the interference pattern that is formed can tell us about the wavelength and other details about the crystals. So atoms and molecules in a crystal acts as slits, and by looking at the interference, or it's also called diffraction pattern, there's some technical differences between diffraction and interference, but that's not relevant here. So it makes for good imaging, X-ray crystallography. And in fact, that was the technique which was used to figure out the double helix structure of DNA for the first time. Let's look at figure 29. So this is an example of, so this is X-ray diffraction or interference from the crystal of a protein, Heg and lysozyme is what produced this interference pattern. So you see these dots and so forth. And analysis of this pattern yields information about the structure of the protein. So it's a commonly used and very powerful technique. Okay, let's look at problem number 28. The maximum characteristic X-ray photon energy comes from the capture of a free electron into a K shell vacancy. We haven't talked about shells yet, but it's just the K that we were talking about earlier in the context of X-rays. So that's all we need to know. What is this photon energy in keV for tungsten, assuming the free electron has no initial kinetic energy? So the initial energy is 0. The K shell corresponds to n equals 1, the ground state, which means the transition is from an excited state to the ground state. EK alpha, so that would be from n equals 2 to n equals 1, is EI is the difference of energies. And if the initial energy is 0, and for the final energy, we need to replace Z by Z minus 1 in the equation for energy, because this is the K spikes that we are talking about. So E is Z minus 1 squared over N squared times E naught, which is negative 13.6. And then you look up the Z for tungsten, it's 74, so 74 minus 1. And it comes out to 72.5 keVs, the energy corresponding to the energy of these photons corresponding to this transition. And some more applications of what happens when atoms go from ground state to excited state. So there are different possibilities in nature. Starting with how objects attain their colors. So if you have a blue object, it appears blue because its atoms have energy levels separated by energy gaps corresponding to all the colors except blue. So all the colors get absorbed by these atoms, but blue is not. And that is why when light reflects from this object, you see blue light, but you don't see other colors. Transparent materials don't have any energy levels corresponding to visible light, so none of the light is absorbed. All of it basically passes through the material. There's a phenomenon known as fluorescence, and this is a process in which the atom gets excited to energy levels several steps above the initial level. So it absorbs a high energy photon and jumps several steps, several energy levels to get to a higher excited state. And this is typically in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, and that's what's called black light, if you might be familiar with that term. So all these posters and stuff which glow in ultraviolet light is basically due to fluorescence. So it goes to a higher excited state and then returns to the ground state in several steps. So remember, it has jumped several energy levels, and then when it falls back, it does so in several steps. And in doing that, it emits lower energy photons in the visible range. And that is what you're able to see. Many practical applications of this fluorescent paint and dyes are made of substances which allow for fluorescence or exhibit this property. And they appear brighter than usual by converting some ultraviolet photons into visible photons. So since it's falling down in steps rather than all together, the photons that are emitted are lower energy photons than the initial ultraviolet. And that's why they end up in the visible range. Similarly, there are fluorescent bulbs in which the inner walls of the glass bulb is coated with fluorescent material. So when light from the filament hits the wall, hits the fluorescent material, it begins to glow. It makes a transition to a higher excited state and then falls back, giving you visible light. Fluorescent materials are used to tag biological molecules to study DNAs and proteins. So you're able to follow this along. You can actually see what's going on at that level. Another related phenomenon to excitations is phosphorescence. Some excited states of atoms are relatively stable, meaning atoms can stay in those states for a relatively long period of time. And these are known as metastable states. And for these to de-excite, for these to fall back to ground state, it can take hours or days or even months. So it happens over a period of time. And these materials are used to make glow-in-the-dark objects. For example, some toys and dials of some watches, even glow-in-the-dark PJs and so forth. So they all involve dyes which exhibit phosphorescence. Another application of excitation and de-excitation or falling back to ground state is in the construction of lasers. Lasers are basically single wavelength and coherent. These are what are called laser light is monochromatic light, meaning it has just a single frequency, a single color. And coherent means that all of the photons emitted by a laser are in phase. And that helps a laser beam to remain focused over a large distances. So all of the energy of the photons can be delivered wherever the laser hits a target. Let's look at this in a little more detail. So in ordinary matter, most of the atoms are in ground state. So what's shown here is different available energy levels of different states, energy states that are available for an atom. And as you can see, most of the atoms are in the ground state. Now, if you externally provide huge amounts of energy, then these atoms can make a transition to higher energy states. So you start with most atoms in the ground state, you give it some amount of energy, typically using light, photons of certain energy, and then these photons can be absorbed by the atom if their energy matches this gap here. So they're absorbed by the atom and it ends up in a higher energy state. If it has more energy than that, maybe equal to this gap here, then the atom will end up in the fourth excited state or the second excited state, just depending on the energy of the incoming light, incoming photon. Now, these higher states happen to be metastable states, which means uh, the electrons or the atoms can hang around in these states for considerable periods of time. So you provide massive amounts of energy from the outside, and it excites atoms to a variety of metastable states. And most of the states, most of the excited states are not metastable states, and those atoms decay quickly and go back to the ground state. But uh, some electrons which have ended up in metastable state will stay there for a period of time. So this phenomenon is known as population inversion. Population inversion. The reason why it's called population inversion is because, as I was saying, under normal circumstances, most atoms are in ground state. There might be some in the excited states. But in this case, you have sent a whole lot of atoms into metastable states and only a few in the ground state. So you kind of inverted the population, the ratio of population between ground and excited states. So it is possible to get majority of atoms in metastable states by providing energy from the outside, and that's population inversion. Let's look at the next diagram. So the atoms remain in the first metastable state for a prolonged period of time. And then out of all the atoms in the sample, if one of them happens to fall back to the ground state uh, due to a spontaneous de-excitation, so this happens on its own. But in that process, it's going to release a photon. And this photon will, so to speak, wake up the other atoms in the metastable states. When the next door neighbor sees this photon being released, it also ends up falling to the ground state. And that transition is a stimulated de-excitation. This was a spontaneous, but this is stimulated. It's stimulated by this photon. And then you end up with two photons, one from here, and they end up stimulating other neighboring atoms and so forth. So it's a cascading effect that you see here. So if one electron spontaneously falls to ground state, the emitted photon stimulates neighboring atoms to follow suit, and the effect then cascades. All of these emitted photons have exactly the same frequency, and they're all in phase with the triggering photon. In phase, remember, means that their peaks and valleys coincide. And so this is what's called a laser. And the key property of laser is that all of the photons are in phase and they have the same frequency. They're of exactly a single color. The term laser is an acronym for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. And because all of the photons are in phase, there's coherence, and laser light can travel long distances without being scattered. So you can focus laser light at a very small spot in space. Okay, in the next video, we will look at wave nature of matter and how that is responsible for quantization.